Okay, my name is Etienne Wenger. So here at the University of Manchester, I'm a visiting professor, but more generally in life, I'm an independent author and researcher and consultant, and more specifically, you could call me a social learning theorist, in the sense that I'm interested in theories of learning that deal with the social aspects of learning, as opposed to simply the cognitive or biological aspects of learning. Welcome. It's my pleasure to be here and to be talking to you. The title of this lecture is Learning for a Small Planet, Perspective from Social Learning Theory. And the idea of this title is to ask the teacher to think about the students they're going to engage with in their life as citizens of this planet, and ask them to reflect on what does it mean to educate world citizens who become learning citizens in the world. I'm not going to sort of give you a formal run through the kind of learning theory that I've been working with, because you can do that by reading my books. It's a chance to be here live and to exchange our views. I'm going to invite you a little bit into the kind of thinking I do, and then ask you to invite me into your thinking, so that we can see whether there is, some relevance there. So I'm going to start very autobiographically, describing why I came to be interested in this topic. I have found that it is a good way for people to understand what it is. Then I'm going to give them a sense of what the theory is about. What are the main concepts and the main perspective of the theory? And then engage them in reflecting on themselves to think about what that might mean for the way that they would act as teachers. So I'm going to tell them how I started myself as a teacher, and then became interested in research, and started my life as a cognitive science researcher, focusing more on computer models of learning, and then slowly became more interested in social perspective on learning that have to do with how learning is a way of becoming someone in the world, and not simply acquiring information or skills. I was a teacher of French as a second language, and both in Hong Kong and in a school in Denver, and felt that really for those kids in Denver, learning French was kind of like not obviously useful for their life. So I went back to university and started to study computer science, because I thought there would be something relevant to young kids. Soon, I became interested in not just computer science as a topic to teach, but computers as a tool for teaching. So I became interested in what at the time was called computer-based training, went to a university in Southern California to do a PhD on that, and became interested in applications of artificial intelligence and tutoring systems. At that time, the idea was that, hey, we have these computers, the brain is obviously a computer too, why don't we use the computers to create models of the students? And perhaps the teaching programs that we design could follow a model of the students' learning and then correct mistakes. Okay, so you could follow a student doing a little piece of programming, and if the student made a mistake, you try to say, why did student make a mistake? What kind of wrong algorithm does the student have in his or her head, and can we correct that? Those were the kind of ambitions we had at the time. I think the field has changed a lot. I think we almost abandoned that ambition of simulating a teacher. But at the time, I was always a little bit disturbed by the fact that in these models we were building of the student, we always had to push out the question of, what does this mean? What does this learning mean? So we were dealing with construction of algorithm, constructions of information structures, if you will. But the question of meaning was always relegated to, okay, what is math? Why would you want to learn math? Or why would you want to learn programming? What does it mean to you in your life? All these questions, which to me kind of were essential to learning, we had to push them out of the model, hope that somewhere else, a little bit like if you're if a computer sends you a paycheck or something like this. You see what I mean? For you, it has a lot of meaning. This is the work I've done. This is the money I've received. But for the computer that does the printing, it's kind of like, even if it does it right to the cent, a meaningless task. After I wrote my first book, I was invited to join an institute in California. The idea of this institute was the schools of education are going to study classroom learning and do all sorts of experiments on new ways to do classroom learning. Some people ought to ask the question of what is learning? What assumptions are we making about learning? And basically, our task as a research institute was to rethink learning. They had brought together people from different disciplines to do that. So I was coming from computer science, but there were people coming from linguistics, there were people coming from anthropology, from psychology, from education. And it was very interesting to see that the question of how to rethink learning among those disciplines very quickly came to a question of what assumptions are you making about what a learner is? And of course, from computer science, the assumption was a learner is an information processor. Obviously, the brain is an information processing machine. So a learning is an information processor. You give that learner the right data, and that learner will construct the knowledge that you wanted. And the anthropologist was like, this is absurd. This is totally uninteresting to me. Because for me, a learner is a person who is becoming a member of a society, and they are trying to understand what the society is about, what the rituals of that society is about. I mean, you can imagine the anthropologist kind of looking at learning on an island or something like this. And so very quickly, the question of what is learning and how to have an account of learning came down to what assumptions are you making about the nature of the learner. And it was interesting for me, I was a graduate student at the time, to see how that debate became intense. How these professors who had joined this institute to do that research felt threatened by someone who was questioning their assumptions about the world and the value of the research and so on and so forth. At the time, to me, it was a kind of a lesson in seeing how, even for these professors, their identity was really involved in their own work, and just simply questioning the assumption of like, well, maybe this is good programming, what you're doing, but it's not relevant to me. Or, well, but your description of your tribe and is nice literature, but it's not science because you cannot reproduce the behavior, you know? How these questions were perceived as really threatening by these, you know, well-established professors. For me, as a graduate student, it was a really interesting experience, and in some sense was a foreshadowing the kind of theory that was to come out of that process. So the next section will cover the theory itself. So I'm going to try to explain to them what is a social perspective on learning. They may not be very familiar with that because mostly learning theories are focused on the cognitive aspects of learning as opposed to the social aspects. So I'm going to, in a second section, give them a sense of how concepts like social practice, social communities, where those practices belong, a notion of identity as a relationship between the person and social communities, how these concepts actually form a perspective on learning that may be relevant to their work. I started to work with an anthropologist. She had done a lot of work in apprenticeship in Africa among tailors. And so we started to look at apprenticeship as a form of learning. And one of the reasons we started to focus on apprenticeship as a mode of learning was because we wanted to separate learning from teaching. We didn't want to think that learning was the consequence of teaching. We wanted to see how does learning take place in and of itself in a context in which the thing that a person is learning is directly relevant to who they are becoming. Okay? So for us, it was interesting to look at apprenticeship because we wanted to say, okay, how do we think of learning outside of a schooling process? And apprenticeship was an age-old learning system where knowledge had not been separated into a curriculum, but was part of becoming a tailor. So if you were an apprentice tailor in Africa, you started by running errands for your community. So the first thing you did is to kind of understand in this community, what do people need? Where do they send me to buy stuff? And then you saw the buttons all the way back to cutting the fabric. It was the last thing that you did as an apprentice. So it was interesting to see how the curriculum for those students was a series of activities that was the inverse of the production process as a way to allow them to understand what the practice was about. And so this term community of practice, with which my name is associated because I've written a lot about it, started simply as an effort to give a name to this living curriculum that we're observing in these cases of apprenticeship. And the reason we focused on the notion of a community was that apprenticeship is often thought of as a relationship between a master and a student. But in fact, in these cases that we were observing in the world, there was a whole community. And as an apprentice, you were basically finding your way into that community. At the beginning, not interacting with the master very much. There was kind of a distant figure, you know, interacting much more with other apprentices at kind of your level, and then moving in, and at some point, becoming a master tailor yourself. And so that term, community of practice, was at first simply a way to talk about that living curriculum that existed in the community. But what was interesting is that once we had that concept of a community of practice, then we started seeing that process of learning in all sorts of circumstances where there was no formal institution of apprenticeship. We started seeing it even in schools with kids on the playground, learning different ways of being a kid, being a person, being a student in an institution, depending on which friendship group you belong to. You would learn very, very different things about the institution, about your relationship with the institution, experience of marginality, experiences of playing the game of the institution, and so on and so forth. She was even observing that you were learning different things about who you are as a person. So she would ask some girls in one group, do you share your clothes with your friends? And they would say, yes, of course. That's what friendship is for. And in another group, for the same question, she would get an answer like, of course not. Everybody would notice. And to me, what's really beautiful about this kind of ethnographic research is how learning and belonging to a community really yielded different ways of being in the world, different sense of what it means to be yourself in relationship to others. In the same way that for the tailors, learning how to sew a suit was part of becoming a certain person. At that time, something happened to me that I want to share with you, because I think it's a good example of what we were trying to capture. I was invited to a friend's house for dinner, and that friend served me a glass of wine. And he asked me, so what do you think? So I tried the wine, and you know, I don't know much about wine. So I said, it's pretty good. And it turns out that he is a wine taster. And so he started to tell me what that glass of wine was to him. And you know these kind of carvings of the 16th century where you kind of open the sky and you see another universe? I had an experience like this, because all of a sudden, that glass of wine, which for me was kind of okay, was this symphony of different tastes and chocolate and strawberry, and it was like this amazing description of something that for me just didn't exist. You know what I mean? And then he goes into this kind of trance state on this glass of wine, and he says, and this one has a really good purple in the nose. English is not my mother tongue, but I thought I understood nose, and I thought I understood purple, and yet what he was saying didn't make sense to me at all. Because apparently, for those of you who are not wine taster, let me tell you that the nose he was talking about was not the nose of the person drinking the wine, because my first thought was, yeah, that's true, people who drink a lot of wine tend to have a purple nose. But that was obviously, I knew that's not what he was talking about, but apparently it's the wine that has a nose. There I was, you know, we had the same glass of wine sitting across the same table, and so I think that the main difference between his experience of the glass of wine and mine was that his experience represented the practice of a community and mine didn't, because I don't belong to that community. And to me, I was like, wow, yeah, this is very much the understanding of learning, the understanding of knowledge that we are trying to capture with this notion of a community of practice, with this notion of knowledge being part of human practice, is that we create a system of meaning in our communities. And as a learner, it is not enough to know the language. You have to really kind of enter the experience, the meaning through the experience of belonging to that community. There was a part of me that said, yeah, I'd like to learn how to do that. That would be fun. But then I also had to sort of think, well, I don't have time for that. You know, I'm just going to stick with beer and move on. Appreciate that little window into this extraordinary world I've seen and move on with my life. So you can see, again, how my identity, my experience of who I was an important factor in allowing me to tell you without blushing that I still don't know what a good purple is in wine, because I'm not accountable to that community. See, I don't feel a sense of membership, and therefore what they know is a nice little curiosity as a tourist, but I don't feel personally accountable to that piece of knowledge. So the third section then will be engaging them in thinking, how does this perspective apply to schooling? Now, one thing that is interesting about that is that that perspective has often been used to critique schools as an institution and to say there is a real problem with the view of knowledge that a school represents, which is a view of knowledge as something you can package in a curriculum and serve to students in a very sterile environment of a classroom. And so I'm going to ask them to reflect with me, if you are to be in a school, then how would you adopt a perspective like this as a way to engage the student in having a meaningful experience of learning as opposed to simply learning for the test? And so when you are with your students in the classroom and you are given a curriculum to impart to them, I would like to invite you to think about this sense of knowing as being a person in the world who is accountable or not accountable to certain locations, if you will, who has to manage an identity, who has to manage the becoming of who they are, and decide, is this for me? And why should it be for me? The reason I'm trying to convey that to you as future teachers is that my experience of how teachers are trained is very much in terms of imparting a curriculum. But this learning theory would suggest that imparting a curriculum is only a small part of what teaching is about. That the invitation of a person into who they are is actually another very, very important part of what it means to allow a person to see a new trajectory, to see a new way of being. The teachers who have had an impact on me in my education, they were always teachers who invited me into who they were. See, I still remember that teacher who read The Little Prince to us. And what was really significant is that he loved that story so much. And the way he was reading it to us. But I still remember to this day, you know, that feeling I had of like, wow, if this is what it means to appreciate a book, I want to be that too. And to me, that remains to this day a very important part of the teaching about how to read. I'm not saying there's nothing technical about learning how to read. Obviously, you need to be able to decode the text. But again, this is only a small part of what learning is about, you see? And sometimes there is so much talk about the curriculum. What is the curriculum? How can we impart the curriculum? That we ignore, in fact, the most profound part of what it means to be a teacher, which is to invite students into a new way of being in the world. Think of your own profession. You are now being taught how to be a teacher. And so the university has taken the body of knowledge of pedagogy and teaching and has created a year program to impart this knowledge to you. I think you can think of the body of knowledge of the teaching profession as a landscape of different practices that are all in some sense competing and in some sense collaborating to create a view of what good teaching is. You have school headmasters who have their opinions of what should happen. You have perhaps parents, you have maybe professional societies. From a living standpoint, the body of knowledge is a system of different practices, all contributing in different ways to how the profession that you're entering is defined in the world and defined for you. And for you, as teacher, you have to see, how am I accountable to this? You could, from this theoretical perspective, describe the notion of a professional as someone who is representing a landscape of practices, the person who has to resolve these different places into a moment of like, what do I do with this student? Am I accountable to this piece of research? Am I accountable to this directive of my headmasters? Am I accountable to my own experience? It is true for your students also. They are also entering a landscape of different practices, but the landscape is actually complexifying. Do I follow this Twitter feed? Do I read this book? Do I read this research paper? As we move into a very information-rich society, the question of knowing and the question of learning is very much, where am I going to place my accountability? Well, the final section, I'm going to ask them to see themselves as learning citizens and to reflect on how they themselves act as learning citizens in the world today. And so I'm going to conclude this, invite you into thinking that in fact, the creation of an identity with respect to all these different practices, some of where you are a member, some where you are just a peripheral participant, discovering who you are in that landscape is actually at the very core, at the very center of what learning is about. So access to information is not your prerogative. You probably don't do this as well as Google. So don't think that access to information is the big deal about your being a teacher. You know? Do we know what to teach our kids so that they are ready for life? Can we claim to know that? I'm not even sure. It's a very good idea to think we're going to prepare those kids for life and we're going to give them the curriculum that they need. And how do you then, as learning citizens yourself in this world, become a guide, become an invitation to others to to also learn how to manage who they are as a learner. Yes.
I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Wenger. I believe that the history of education in this country has been to provide a useful working force. And of course, that doesn't go very well with this idea of inspiration, although what you've said has been my own experience personally of life. That's the question. It's not a speech.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to enter the political conversation about whether schools should prepare people for work life or not. Because I think there's a whole conversation there about the role of schooling in a civic society and in an economy. What I have found is that today, even from an economic standpoint, the people who are high contributors in our society are people who are engaged, who engage their identity with something. And then they use that as a way to solve a problem, as a way to have a new idea. Those are the high contributors. So I think that whatever we think about the political role of schools, I think that we have to move from this industrial model of filling heads with curriculum to a very, very different model of how do we, because my son, he told me the problem about this high school is that you can't be interested in anything. Basically what he was telling me is that if you want to have reasonable grades, you have to run from one class to the other, do what the teacher says, and you are not allowed to be interested. I was thinking, my goodness, what have we done? My experience of the high contributors are not people who run from class to class. My experience of the high contributors are people who are really interested in something. You know? So, have we created an institution that at the most formative years of a person prevent someone from having that experience? I think we need to really question, what does it mean to educate learning citizens that are going to be contributors? And so I would say, you as teachers have the responsibility of understanding what this means practically. Look, if it is true that those teachers who had an influence on me were people who were passionate about something and invited me into their passion for a little bit, why is it that passion is nowhere on the criteria list of qualifying for being a teacher? It's not even talked about. We have gone so far into a view of knowledge as this kind of dead thing that can be put in a curriculum and imparted into heads and then good tests to see, yes, it has made it into that head. See what I mean? I can promise you it has made it into that. I've tested it. Here's your student, mathematically enabled. Assembly line, go home. It's almost like we have forgotten that this is not all that knowing is about. Not to say that there should not be a curriculum. I'm not saying that there should not be some discussions about what do we teach and what not. But if the curriculum has filled 4 years of a student's life where they have to tell you, I'm not allowed to be interested in anything for 4 years, the most formative years of my life, I think we've gone too far. I think we've gone too far with this business of curriculum. So.
You're saying that you have to be passionate about a certain subject in order to teach it. Say you're passionate about maths, but you're teaching an English class. Can you still be a good teacher?
I would think twice, if I was a headmaster, about putting someone to teach something that they don't care about. If you want to light up the love for literature in a student, you're going to have that love yourself, because you cannot manufacture it. Yeah.
In your encounter with the wine taster, you got a glimpse into a rich and exciting world, but you decided not to join that world because it didn't fit with your sense of identity. When we're dealing with reluctant learners, possibly from deprived backgrounds, what we're asking, and particularly, for instance, if we're talking about going to university, we're asking them to enter a world where they're going to possibly feel quite uncomfortable. It's going to be very different to what they're used to. It might alienate them from their families and from their peers. How can we persuade those people to go against their sense of identity and still enter the world that we're inviting them into?
If I had the answer to what you're saying, you know, I would try to become a Minister of Education. I'm not quite ready for prime time in that sense, right? But before you love something, you have to try it, right? But I think that, at least from my theoretical perspective, I think you will not be able to completely bypass the fact that you have to offer people an identity in whatever you want to push them into. That ethnographer I was telling you about, she was asking these questions to these different groups of girls. What she was interested in was just why is it that these girls in this group pronounce English in this way? That was her interest. Once these students believed that she had no other agenda but to just understand who they were and what they were trying to express by pronouncing English in that way, she said it was like opening a floodgate. And we were thinking, maybe those kids have lived in this institution for a long time. They've never met someone who was not a role in an institution. All of a sudden, these kids from very poor working class background were asking us, so what is it to be a professor in a university? What is it like? Tell me. You know, and I have no idea. It's completely outside of the scope of what I can think about because I've never met someone. See what I mean? All of a sudden, here was a real identity open to them as a person to person. And they were very interested in what it was like to be in a university. But they didn't trust the school to tell them the real story. Yeah.
Have you seen any examples, apart from your own experiences at school, of where communities in practice have been working well?
Yeah, but the places where I've seen work well is more in workplace context, where people have a passion together. So people who are passionate about rural water supplies at the World Bank have formed a little community. And from different countries, they help each other develop a practice of doing that well. For them, their belonging to that community is an essential part of how they view themselves as able to do the job that they do. It's a kind of peer-to-peer partnership where they recognize each other as, okay, you're interested in that too. So let's work it out together. How do we do this thing that is very difficult? And I've seen many, many examples of that. Actually, most of my work today is not in education. Most of my work today is in work context, where traditionally vertical organizations that have viewed knowledge as a vertical process of extracting knowledge from practice, creating a curriculum or a training program and then serving it back, or a procedure and serving it back. These organizations are saying, maybe we need to start thinking differently about learning, and we need to encourage people creating this horizontal learning partnership. We call them committees of practice. Some people may call them learning networks, whatever. I have seen that work also in some educational context, where some teachers have actually agreed to break the walls of their classroom and the solitude of the traditional teaching experience, and to actually form communities among themselves to help each other experience what it is to be a teacher. So instead of just having this vertical view of a source of knowledge that pours down knowledge into a recipient of knowledge, to say, okay, no, it's a mutual negotiation of like, what do you know, what do I know? And how do these two forms of knowledge meet each other in a way that's meaningful and productive? It's a very different approach. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to challenge something you said, that's all. Yeah. When you said that teacher trainers are trying to get trainees to impart a curriculum, I just want to challenge that as a man of straw and perhaps ask you to justify the statement.
I'm certainly not putting teacher trainers or future teachers down or anything, you know. I'm just trying to sort of open a window to say, okay, we have focused a lot here. Is there also something else we should learn to focus on? And you see, the reason why I'm not trying to become the Minister of Education, because I remember actually I was talking about this idea in Canada, and the Minister of Education was there in the province of Alberta, and he asked me, so what should I do? And I had to admit that I was happy I was not the Minister of Education of the province of Alberta, because I'm not exactly sure myself how to take that into an institutional setting and how to institutionalize that, right? Because if it is true that identity and the transformation of identity is at the core of the educational enterprise, then how do we institutionalize that? I think the theory would show some kind of directions to move towards, like having traversed a boundary of practice that really kind of shakes your identity. Could that become part of how we think about the curriculum? You know what I mean? We think so much about the curriculum in terms of information, but could we think about every student must, at least one in their life, have experienced the crossing of a boundary where on the other side of that boundary the identity doesn't function? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like for me, moving from Switzerland to the US when I was 20-something. All of a sudden, living in a place where my identity, that nice little Swiss identity I had formed that was so successful in Switzerland, just doesn't work. You see, there is a discipline of identity. If you start thinking about knowing an identity as being related, then it's not like, you know, I'm suggesting that you know, we ask our kids, so what do you feel like doing today, you know? But if there's one thing you're interested in, and I don't care if it is playing the guitar, or if it is swimming the breaststroke, but for that thing you're interested in, we're going to ask you to reach the level where you can interact with the masters of that practice. But my son was not given that experience by his school. He had to do this outside of school, you know? So maybe we think, okay, this is not the role of schools, to give that transformative experience of pushing all the way into a practice and reaching mastery, you know? What does that do to you? What kind of discipline of the being does it take, you know, to do that? It's almost more important than what domain you do it in, because that experience of knowing what it takes to become really, really good at something, to become really interested, to become really passionate, is something that is probably transferable as your interests change in life. But if you've never had that through 12 years of schooling, are you ready? Are you ready for life? I don't know. I don't know. I think that I need to do my own time management because we were supposed to be done a while back, and I'm terrible. Even though I was born in Switzerland, I'm terrible at time management. I would like them to remember that thinking of learning, of teaching as a transmission of a curriculum is only a limited perspective on learning, and that to think of learning as a development of a full identity as a human being is another perspective that can enrich their life. And so really, I wish you well in your ambition to become a teacher. I think that this is one of the great vocations that there can be. But I think it is also true that you are going to enter institutions that often doesn't recognize the very essence of that vocation. And so I think it's going to take some discipline for you to keep that flame alive wherever it is that you are that you're going to practice your craft. So really, all the best to you. Thank you. I'm hoping that what students will take away from this lecture is a question about how learning can be made meaningful for students who have a life beyond the classroom, who are full human beings. And so I'm going to ask them to live that question in their life.